You're listening to the Physio Matters podcast in association with exerciseprescriber.com, and this is session 59. Welcome back to Physio Matters. I'm Jack Chew, and thanks a lot to everyone that downloaded last month's episode with the NIHR Dissemination Centre. We're talking about Moving Forward, which is a document compiled as a theme review by a working group I was involved in. I spoke to Nadine Foster, Ruth Tenhove and Mike Hurley about that document, and we've had a spike in downloads of that and lots of people feeding back about how much they've enjoyed the read and how they can then use that as leverage in discussions to demonstrate the evidence in support of MSK practice, which is of course brilliant. That's what we're all about. So really pleased that that's gone down well. It was a tricky episode to bring together. As soon as there's many different voices that aren't in the same place, especially, then it's sometimes hard to lace that together. So I'm pleased we managed to do that, and thank you to the NIHR for their support in doing so. Last episode came out the day after the Big R's conference, so the dust was still far from settled on that at that point in time, and we just can't believe the response that we've had. It turns out we've had 34.1 million impressions on social media on that hashtag, and therefore it's reached far and wide. When I got into work the next day, came to find out that I had voicemails and emails from lots of key stakeholders across the UK and beyond into the world, and thanks to those of you that have got in touch asking how you might be able to initiate similar movements in your countries or in your locality. We certainly are exerting influence, and people are excited to try and join the conversation as best they can. So please do join on reform.physio/community. Unbelievable response to that. Within a few days we had over 800, and now it's certainly beyond 1,000 within the first few weeks of people that have registered to download the slides from the event, for them to look at this working group summaries of what we're trying to develop in movement towards our manifesto for reform. If you want to watch the live streams of the event, then go to buytickets.at/reformingmsk. That's buytickets.at/reformingmsk to get access to, which grants you access to a Facebook group in which all of the material from the whole conference, including the workshops, was recorded into, and so you can access that and be part of that conversation, having seen and visited the conference virtually. Got a clinical podcast for you next month, which is going to be our last of the year and our 5-year anniversary, 60 episodes of monthly podcasts, which is crazy. And that's going to be about the treatment and management of lateral epicondylopathy. I always struggle with that word. Tennis elbow, let's stick with that. That's why it's a good term. And but generally speaking, we want to make sure that we bring you variety across 2019. It's just a number of aspects and elements that we're trying to work in, and variety of different styles of podcasts that we're doing in 2019. Jack March has taken over the organisation and strategy of that, just to make sure that Physio Matters doesn't get lost in the Big R's noise. And of course we've got lots of stuff that really is implementing some of the listening that you've been doing. There's lots of ways in which you can now get involved in trying to move this forward and making sure that we don't just keep talking, we actually make sure there's some action underneath it. So keep an eye out for exciting developments and events. Talking of exciting developments and events, we have the Big R's working group for education, reforming education, which is run by Reena Patel. It's hosting a great event next month in December at Wolverhampton University. Many thanks to them for reaching out to us and supporting the process. And so at the Walsall campus on Wednesday the 5th of December from 6 till 9 we'll run the event. So from 5:30 we will be arrivals, and food and drink will be provided. We're doing an event which we're calling what we hope will be a series called Thinking in Public, in which we then naming this one Education: Are We Meeting the Needs of Contemporary MSK Practice? And so we'll have panel discussion in and around that, trying to who feels that things need to be improved or reformed, who feels that things need to be conserved, and that the rate of change is sufficient at present. We're going to have that out on a panel discussion, then split to round tables and discuss more detail in that direction. So really excited for that, and that's exactly the sort of thing that we're working towards on the Big R's, trying to turn any institution or space that we can into public discussion, which of course will be live streamed. But if you can get involved, then do pay attention to our social media for how to get tickets on the 5th of December. The event will be free of charge, as supported by the University of Wolverhampton or
a maybe negligible booking fee just to make sure that we can guarantee numbers for catering and some drinks. So really excited for that, and it's just an example of the broadness of content that we're going to be able to create for you through Physio Matters and the Big R's. But we won't be forgetting our roots. We'll be doing specific clinical content and walkthrough guides to the latest and greatest.
And to bring this together, one of the things we've got now is the studio up in Manchester. We've put a studio in my office instead of converting it to another clinic room in headquarters. We've tried to take the punt of can we produce some content in this direction to make sure that we can then support this studio. And so in doing so, I wanted to get my friend Heather Watson, who I've been having great dialogue with about the personal injury market and the way in which people are managed after they've had non-fault accidents. And that was something that we've been talking about off air for a number of years. But especially recently, I've come to realise that it's something that really helps us to touch on the ethical underpinnings and philosophies of why we do what we do, but in terms of rehab and where the lines are and how it maps onto society at large, an increasingly litigious society in which those factors do play a part in people's behaviour and the way that they respond to adversity. So I'm really pleased to get Heather in the studio, and it was the first time we tried the mics out, so hope the sound quality is good. I think we've had a look through it and it seems to be good. So I hope you really enjoy this wide-reaching and personal interview and insight into the personal injury market of various different levels. So thank you to Heather, thank you to you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you at the other side of this interview. I bring you Heather Watson. I'm here today for a very special edition of what we could call the Physio Matters podcast, but essentially it's our first time in this studio, our brand new studio, and the very first person I wanted in here to talk about a really important topic that's dear to both of us is Heather Watson, who you will have heard potentially already on the Physio Matters podcast. I don't know what episode that was, but it's a while ago now, isn't it? And so, but this time I wanted to try and, as many of our interviews have sort of taken a turn in recent times, towards trying to elicit a real personal narrative from people that have had incredible journeys, especially in different and diverse marketplaces, in terms of the way in which they integrate their ideas. And Heather's got an amazing story that I've become more and more au fait with as I've worked within her project in Design to Move. And so I want you to know what I've got to know, and so I want to tease out some of that information from Heather on air and find out what makes her tick, what makes her business tick, as well as then just getting a hot take on the sector in general. So for those who don't know yet, I want to invite Heather Watson to introduce yourself, if you would, to start off with, to the listeners in case they don't already know you.
Thank you, Jack. So I'm Heather. I was on the podcast, I think it was something like episode 15, but don't hold me to that.
Wow.
Talking about musculoskeletal care and health and workplace. What do you need to know about me? I now run my own company independently, so Design to Move, and still do a little bit of work on Health Work Matters in terms of occupational health and return to work advice. We serve, in terms of Design to Move, we work with people who've been seriously injured and need to get back to doing the things they love, whether that be their hobbies, their family life, or needing to go to work. Those are the sorts of things we work on.
Brilliant. And what I wanted to sort of start this chat for is, because we don't want to cover too much old ground, but it's kind of like I think there's the sector in which you work is something that a lot of physios are aware of, and a lot of physios have at least dabbled with it or thought that they understand it. And people, I don't know, I'm not sure if I've ever met a physio that hasn't treated a whiplash and therefore think that they then understand every part of the litigation market. So, as a general rule, could you give an overview of that side of our world, of the sector, and how you've interacted with that over the years?
Yeah, so I suppose my first encounter with the personal injury sector, which is essentially now where Design to Move functions most, was probably 2008, 2009. I was running my own private practice at the time. That took in all sorts of clients from all the usual insurers, private medical insurance, self-payers, and then occasionally I would get a complex client from a case manager. And I happened to have a friend who was a case manager at the time as well. She really loved the way that I worked, which was fantastic, but I didn't really think an awful lot more of it. As time went by, I actually personally got to the point where I realised that the private practice itself just wasn't really suiting me, and I couldn't see myself staying in that long term. So that's when I actually moved back into the NHS, where I set up the musculoskeletal fitness for work service, which was all about returning staff to work after a period of prolonged absence, or if they were having repeated absences. So set up that as a brand new service. That was 3 or 4 days a week, and I was just doing a little bit of private practice on the other days, and that was a great experience. We really developed that service. We really developed what we would term occupational rehabilitation, so the ability to take people on from where they'd done really well with perhaps what I'd class as standard physio. They'd done quite well, but they still had functional needs that were unmet, including obviously return to work. So we started to work in this model. It was just me to start with. And then a couple of other colleagues joined me. And as time went by with this over the years, I thought actually this model could really work outside of the NHS as well. One of the frustrations there was, we weren't able to actually bring in people from the general public to use our service, even though people could have really benefited from it. And so with the hours when I wasn't working for the NHS, I started to pick up a few more of these more unusual clients that were coming through the personal injury market, that were being referred by the case managers, and using this similar approach, what we now call functional rehabilitation or functional restoration approach. So that's how it kind of all started to come together. And then, of course, as that happened, I started to research the market a bit more, try and find out a bit more about how it works and what goes on there. And one of the interesting things is that they have what's called the Rehabilitation Code, which was last revised in 2015, and that was quite significant, I think, for case managers and therapy providers, because it meant that everybody involved in a claim, the defendant, the claimant, the therapy providers, the case managers, are required to sit down and sort out a rehabilitation plan with an aim to restore that client to as close as their pre-injury status as you can, regardless of the long-term outcome of the claim. So that means that everyone is working in the same direction, and it's collaborative, although it doesn't necessarily always quite feel like that. But that, I think, is a real opportunity for us to be a part of a team, which is not necessarily a team we're traditionally introduced to.
Sure.
And then it's kind of grown from there.
Yeah, well, that's a funny thing, isn't it? Because when people say multidisciplinary team, they're often meaning fellow medical professionals. But true interdisciplinary action is when you're seeing the sort of legal industry as well.
Yeah, so typical team for us will be a case manager who may be independently appointed. There's what's called a joint instruction, where solicitors and insurers on both sides of the claim both agree to appoint a case manager. That would be a joint instruction. Sometimes it's what's called a single instruction, so where one side has asked the case manager to come on board and be a part of bringing that team together. So so there may well be a therapy team, the case manager of which is the coordinator of that. They oversee all the different interventions, they pull together all the reports, they make sure all that information then gets delivered on to the insurers and the solicitors, of course, who are often the people funding the services. So there's quite a team, and we may be 4 steps away from the people who are actually having to fund the service. And then, of course, at the centre of that is the client, and trying to make sure that all the time our services are focused on the client's needs and getting them to back as close as we can to that pre-injury status is the priority.
Keeping an eye on the needs and wants as well, which I think we'll come to, and just trying to work out how to mitigate any perverse incentives that can exist. And one of the things is the Rehab Code, which we definitely will come back to. I just want to go back though to what it was that you almost, because it was a whistle-stop tour, you almost sort of then I got really into functional restoration, as if it was like there wasn't an obvious cleaving off from what is considered standard practice. So you mentioned standard therapy, and then you mentioned functional restoration. It's like, yeah, I know what you mean, but we can't. It's not an obvious thing. It's like sometimes we're having to take people kicking and screaming from that. Sometimes it's, for all of us, a very difficult process, because there's something almost tethered to our professional badge and professional identity that involves rubbing, poking, and small knee bends. It's like it's quite a narrow scope that sometimes we're seen under. So
talk about that part of the journey. Let's just zoom in on
Okay.
that for a sec.
Well, for me, actually, functional rehabilitation has always been part of my identity as a physio. That's why one of the reasons I went into physio. I wanted an active job. I was interested in physical activity. I liked physical activity myself, and that's what I believe the job would be about. So early on in my career, I ended up in occupational health. And that meant we were always focused on people's goals, their functional outcomes. So how are you going to get back to that bit of your job? How are you going to get back to climbing that ladder or squatting down to, put those plugs in or whatever it is that somebody needs to be able to do for work. So for me, that has always been standard practice. And some of the other things that I suppose now we might term as adjuncts were things that I added on as and when I needed them. But the core for me was always the physical activity and the functional goals. So I suppose when it became really apparent, and it's more apparent obviously in some sectors of the markets that we operate in than others, but that their general view of physiotherapy can be that it can unfortunately be very passive. And yet my view of it has always been that it's a very active process and the client is an active part of that. And when I was in the NHS service, that was a very interesting dynamic because we were physios working for occupational health. Within the rest of the trust, there were probably over 100 outpatient physiotherapists of all levels of experience and all those sorts of things. And that was very interesting because what we were there to do was to get people back to work, which meant when they came for an assessment with us, the assessment they got was very functionally focused. We used lots of outcome measures. We used functional testing based on an occupational health model. And yet for some of the patients, this wasn't at all what they were expecting because our goal was really clear to get them back to work, back to function. So I suppose in terms of my own business and then taking that decision, actually a decision to run a company that only provides active rehabilitation has its challenges.
Tell me about it.
It has its challenges in terms of what expectations people have about the services we're going to provide, both clients and referrers. More often than not the clients, but we've now got a system of education in terms of the information we give out about what to expect about our programme because we want people on board with the programme. They need to be a full part of it.
Promise, do you? But there is a wedge issue though. The active passive thing I think is great, and I think we're definitely right to touch that. But equally, I think that there's another piece to that though, which is that under the banner of active rehabilitation, there is, I think, a wedge issue in therapy at the moment and in the industry at large, especially the public don't necessarily engage with it yet, but it's almost like movement normalization versus just functional scaling, in which I've always seen your work as landing on the functional side of it, regardless of the nitpicking that can sometimes happen with regards to biomechanics, and obviously that maps onto ergonomics and the likes, where people would, some call normal, some call optimal, there's lots of different language to it, but essentially that is still under the guise of active. There's not, it often involves exercises and positions and postures and things like that, but it's the idea of textbook versus actually individualized in such a way that you don't then try to normalize. And although there's a grey area, and we can talk about that if we need to, but I just think that, was there ever a moment in which you, whilst always into active rehabilitation, where you kind of realise that the training wheels can come off this model? It's almost like actually the scope is broader than we learnt about in therapy.
Yeah, I suppose, I've now been qualified long enough to have had a foot in the camp of the real heavy manual therapy period. I did my Syriacs training, and I can still remember being terrified about not putting my fingers in the right place to do said mobilizations or frictions, because if I didn't get my hands in the right place, it probably wouldn't work. So I can remember that. And I was using that in occupational health alongside functional rehabilitation. I think it's been an evolution. There have been times where, for me, there's been times where I've suddenly realised I can be more intuitive about what somebody needs and which approach to take. I'm somebody who likes to learn how to do things properly, so I will kind of learn it the textbook way, and then when I get happy with it, I'll tend to be more intuitive and let it flow, and therefore probably make it more individualised. So I think I've probably got better at that over the years. And I think it's that keeping the function at the heart of it. And there are some times when we do need to go back to the fundamentals. We need to get the right range of motion, we need to get good enough strength, we need to get good enough balance in order to then build the function. There are components that we have to break it down and do the basic stuff and then rebuild it up into the function. There's lots of different ways to do that.
No, absolutely. And that's what I mean about the grey area, I suppose, is that it doesn't have to be absolutist. I mean, some people just think that it's all about graded exposure in of the complete task. And it's just that if someone wants to get back running, it's just that the first answer is running. It's like, well, no, we sometimes need to strip it to its component parts to some extent and then expose gradually, which takes the skill set.
No, we definitely sort of break it down to, what are the functional elements of the task? And again, from an occupational health point of view, we talk about job demands and breaking down the different parts of the job. And it's just taking that to its full conclusion and saying, well, in order to bend down, and I'm looking at the new socket in Jack's studio, in order to get down and install a socket, what have you got to be able to do? You've got to be able to, bend in all your lower limbs, and you've got to be able to get your spine flexion in there. You've got to have the capacity to do it. So if somebody can't get down there in the first place, we've got to sort that out before we can start exposing them to it, for how many hours a day they need to be able to do it. So for me, it's just part of a sequence that has to some extent happen in order, not all the time. Sometimes you go off and you might need to do something that's a bigger graded exposure type activity before you can go back to gain the trust or to gain the cooperation, to make it seem relevant to the client before you can go back to some of that stuff. It's being flexible with that order of application and creative with it. I think that helps.
Does that come naturally to you? Because some people, when I've taught it, or it was certainly when I learnt it, and it just felt like it made sense. It felt like finally there was some common sense approach to how we could go about things, and that the scaling someone's function was logical to me. But then, having spoken to others, it sort of doesn't. Stripping that back and then building it back up and being versatile like that, it's too loose. It's not got any tight parameters around it, and some people just don't like it. So does that come natural?
Well, I think it's a mix. So I'd say it's a bit of a yes and a no. Probably naturally, I was always someone who wanted to be functionally focused. That's what I said before, that I think that's what physio is. That's what physio's always been. At the heart of it's about getting people back to doing the things they love to do or need to do. And so my journey to the place where I'm at now has obviously been quite long now and convoluted. And I think, the natural instinct was there, but definitely I would say the confidence wasn't there. So what has really made a difference to me is, having had some really great mentors along the way. And I have to say my occupational health experiences, I was mentored by physio that had been in the role before me, and that made a massive difference because being in occupational health for the first time, nothing is predictable. Everything you come across needs a creative solution, because there's no one answer, there's no one way to get someone back into that role, especially if you don't understand their job. So you've got to be quite a problem solver, and a problem solver on the spot. So that was really valuable. And then another really significant time for me was I did a couple of courses with Joanne Elphinston that some of you will know, and I just loved her approach, and it was a breath of fresh air after having done things like orthopaedic medicine and Syriacs, which had its place. But as we said earlier, I started to move away from that. I found it quite restrictive. The diagnostic side of it I found really, really great, but the treatment side of it I found a bit restrictive. And I didn't know how to move out of that. And when I first did some of the courses with Joanne, she has a very creative approach to looking at movement and function, but also quite logical. And I think she was the first person who I kind of met in the physio world who said, it's okay to do things a little bit differently, and it's okay to work with somebody where they're at, follow your intuition a little bit, and be creative about the solution, and remember that there is not one correct route to get somebody better or back to their function. So I did a couple of courses with her, and then I did them again because I wanted to learn more. And then actually I was fortunate to be asked by her to be an assistant tutor. So I then spent many, many years shadowing her, teaching, assisting with teaching, and teaching her courses on her behalf. And that covered a span of about 10 years. And so that influence, that ability then to think about rehabilitation in a much broader way, to think about movement in a much broader way than I'd traditionally been learning up to that point, was really influential in how I now would build a rehab program, and how I would restore someone's function back up to such a level that we take into account, the environmental factors around them, what they might have to wear at work. So that experience now, that now comes all very naturally to me, took a long time to formulate, and then sort of overlapping with that time was when I started doing some work with ACPO, so the Association of Chartered Physiotherapists in Occupational Health and Ergonomics.
Really catchy acronym.
And I became their lead tutor for their occupational rehabilitation and return to work planning course. So that, of course, meant that we had to start teaching, how do you build someone's capacity for work? How do you plan that so that their return to work is successful? And then, of course, be able to teach that to other people. So that process, I've been involved with that a long time now. And that's obviously evolved as we've learned and I've learned, and that the materials evolved. But that also leads us now to have a reasonably logical approach to how do we get someone's function up, and then enable them to sustain their work in that case.
And so when you put it that way and you talk about that evolution of your journey, do you feel that there's anything underneath that dispositionally for you as a person that meant that you were sort of likely to end up in that, or is it just a series of consequences? Like, do you see anything way back when that meant you were almost craving these opportunities?
Yeah, well, maybe. I don't know if I'd mentioned before that my mum was a physio, and one of my first early experiences of physio, she worked at a school for disabled children. And so there must have been occasions when I must have had to go back to work with her. She'd maybe pick us up from school and take us back, finish her notes or whatever. And I'd kind of get left to my own devices in the physio gym, right. And there I am surrounded by wall bars and wobble boards and Swiss balls and, stuff that looked like fun to me. And I thought, well, this must be a really cool job. So to me, my long held associations of physio were with, fun and activity and stuff like that. So that's what I wanted out of my job. So I suppose I did go seeking those sorts of practical, functional approaches that really made a difference to people's lives.
Yeah, and so for you to have had that assumption over the fact that there was some play involved because you associated it with play, it became less playful, and then you've aspired to more play as your career's developed. Is that fair enough for me to say?
Yeah, I suppose so. And I think it's easy. I'm sure there's people who feel it at the moment you feel boxed in by some of the very academic approaches, some of the very structured approaches to treatment, and we've had a bit of you've got to do it this way or it won't work. A lot of the manual therapy approaches, and people being very didactic about which approach you must use, and to then feel liberated to use your own creativity and your intuition and what the client in front of you needs at that moment in time, not what they needed last time, not what they need next time, what they need today from you. That was back to where I believed it was all supposed to be, what it was supposed to be about.
And do you think that case managers that are handling these sorts of these cases and then helping these people that have been in circumstances that are quite traumatic, sort of complex polytrauma cases, for example, that you work with, do you feel that they're in a situation where they feel constrained by a system that is sort of which one of these few flavors of physio or of care should we select from? Because sometimes when I speak to them, they are, but it's just sort of like the menu is quite narrow.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think many of the case managers that we work with are also putting the long-term function of that client as their first priority, and a lot of them recognise the limitations of traditional, what we call standard therapy provision. So I think we're able to just offer a different angle, And of course, we know some people will respond to those approaches, but some people won't, and they need this extra level. And the case managers, I think, are usually pretty good at recognising when they need that extra dimension, that more an integrated approach and more holistic in the truest sense of the word, and the functional rehabilitation, as opposed to, a limited remit of some of the others.
One of the things that I said we'd come back to, and it doesn't need to be specifically about the Rehabilitation Code, but it's an obvious is I wanted to ask what ethical challenges present themselves uniquely in the personal injury market broadly. And if perhaps even we could walk towards certain examples, because I think it's something I underestimated.
Yeah. I think the biggest one that is a complete contrast to occupational health, and it is an interesting one when I stand back and reflect on my career. In my first sort of proper occu health jobs, I would see people within hours of being injured. So they would turn up at the occupational health department having pulled a muscle 2 hours ago, and they would want it checked out and advice on whether to go home or stay at work on modified duties, or and what they could do to look after themselves. So that to me is early intervention, hours. Okay. Then over the years, working in different settings, I've become to realise that was pretty unique. And when I worked in a different NHS job, I was a spinal specialist in an NHS job there. Most people I saw had been on the chronic pain waiting list for at least 9 months. The waiting list was 9 months, so that was kind of longer. And then when I started working in this market, well, it's pretty normal for us to have referrals for people who've been injured 2, 3, maybe even 4 years ago. So that is an interesting dilemma when you would ideally like to be at the front end, stopping or preventing injury, and also where injury can't be prevented, because a lot of the people we see have had serious accidents that probably couldn't have been avoided. But when you really believe in intervening as early as possible to prevent the build-up of disability and psychosocial factors, that was a big shock.
Yeah.
But also, I think what then drove me on to stay within that is that these people really need our help, because actually they've usually been discharged from what's known as statutory services, which is your NHS services, because the resources aren't there to follow them through for the length of time they need, because they've got complex multiple injuries that the NHS services aren't set up to serve.
Yeah. So. Okay. One of the things that it just rings a bell is that Damien Thacker, I'm going to quote Damien on this, is he said that increasingly good physiotherapy feels like counteracting previous bad physiotherapy. Does that resonate?
Yeah, unfortunately it does, and it makes me really quite sad, I think, for the profession. But yeah, we will often be asked to come in after other failed interventions. And an example which is not uncommon, I wish it was uncommon, but it's not, is we would take on a client who maybe has already had up to 30 sessions of physiotherapy, plus or minus other interventions, massage therapy, acupuncture, various other bits as well as. And the frustration with that has been that that has all had to be gone through first, almost, to reach the point of someone saying that isn't working, right, and that a new approach is needed. And I think that it's a little bit in occupational health and across the board. I think now it's much more commonly talked about in MSK practice across the board now, is these ideas of stepped and stratified care. A stepped care is about doing the very minimum intervention, then only doing the next bit when you need to, then doing the next bit when you need to. And so it appears sequential, and it's almost that can happen a lot in our market, in that at the earlier stage of a claim, it's been decided that a person will be sent for standard care physiotherapy or equivalent treatment, but that's sort of just rumbled on and on and on without the functional goal being reached. And if you compare that to our models of stratified care, which is assessing that person's risk earlier in the process and saying, well, actually, that person's pretty high risk of going on to develop disabilities, dropping out of work, all those risk factors that we know we can identify, it might have been better to pull that person out of standard care quicker and put them into a more biopsychosocially driven model of rehab, which is what ours is more like.
Arguably, we see the failings there more than we're not going to encounter the people that 30 sessions. I mean, it pains me to even think about it, but somehow the 30th session was the one that sorted them, and we never see that person. But do you have a hunch as to what percentage of that major injury market end up having unmet final goals, or particularly end up struggling with perception issues as to what the actual prognosis is for their life?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember that the clients we now see, that I personally see, are a biased population, a skewed population. There are plenty of people who are getting effective, good, standard care or private practice care, and they never get to our doors, and they are therefore having their needs met by
but
those
often
services.
the same care, though. I suppose that's what I'm meaning, is that I get that, and you're right, that's a fair caveat, but it's kind of that it's the same care, isn't it, to some extent? Let's just from what we understand anyway, you might not agree with that, but let me wade in with me saying that they've done, say, let's just go 15, 30 seemed greedy, but 15 sessions of your classic sort of manual treatment, home exercise program, let's restore your ability, let's hope they've put a functional angle to it and they've actually tried to do that, but then there's the upper limits of a clinic room.
Yeah.
But that care, that 15 sessions of majority passive and then a bit of an active tinge to it, that care, now and again, the fact that it works, it is a bit of a toss of a coin, roll of a dice sort of thing. It's like, surely we're kind of, it's hard, I don't know, I struggle to give, we don't want to be too besmirching, but equally it's hard to give credit to the fact that they've kind of just got lucky, really. The fact that it just settled, to some extent, it settled down. Because there are ideas that they were instilling in the patient. It's just as bad.
Oh, there's a couple of things there, aren't there? There are some people whose needs will be met because they just don't need the same level of functional scaling.
Yeah.
Their long-term goals, their demands on their body and their livelihoods do not require them to do any more, and that what they have had has been sufficient. And if we take the attitude that actually, most of what is being provided is decent, then people are getting their needs met, and the people, some of the people are getting their needs met, but there's a whole bunch of people for whom that only gets them so far. And this is what became really apparent in the NHS service that we ran, is that people were feeling better about themselves. Maybe they had less pain, they may be managing their pain better, they were a bit more active, but actually they still had big fears about certain activities and tasks, or they still weren't able to participate in a family walk in the way that they would have done before. They maybe 2 or 3 things about their job that they couldn't do, which was critical to them keeping their job. And that is almost, the system runs out of time and resources, or, as you said, the limitations of a clinic room are that there is only so far you can take somebody. And some of the most common things that we now get involved with are going out and doing stuff at the patient's home, in their local gym, in their local park, in their local pool, in their workplace, which the current outpatient models of care, be they private or NHS, just don't permit because of the time pressures and the way the diaries are organised. And so I'm sure there's many, many therapists out there who would love to do what we do now and have that opportunity to take people onto the next level, but the service model that they're working in doesn't allow them to.
Yeah. Just as a thought experiment, if say there was a magic wand that got waved over the industry, the MSK industry, in which the parameters of a clinic room were then breached. It was that given every boss in the land and we were all insured to high heaven, to the point in which if you wanted to take someone out on a hike, you just did. And there was this is again thought experiment, meaning that there wasn't even diary parameters that would restrict you. You just could.
Utopia, yeah.
Absolutely, utopian thinking. Do you think that if that magic wand was waved today, that tomorrow the physiotherapy profession and the industry at large, so not just that profession, that corner of it, but be that sports therapist, sports rehab, all the other peripheral osteopaths, do you think that they have the skill set and the wherewithal and the keenness to say breach that? Or do you actually think that they are banging at the door wanting to burst out of their clinic rooms, or are they actually quite comfortable?
Well, again, the huge variation in that, and I'm sure there are people who are desperately frustrated by it and would absolutely embrace it. and would find a way to do it. I'm sure there's also a group of people who would love to do it, but actually they've been brought up in the current model. They have got no idea how they would make that happen.
Right.
And there may well be some who don't realise that the doors have been opened and they just carry on doing what they're doing. So yes, I think there would be a need for understanding how to do that and how to do it safely and how to do it effectively. But that's all stuff that, good MSK practitioners can learn, because that's the sort of stuff that, we teach in our occupational rehab. That's the stuff that we're doing now with our new associates that come on board. As time goes by, we'll be providing more and more of that, because showing people the possibility and then showing them the way that they can support someone to get there is all stuff that we're familiar with, but we may not have had the opportunity to practice it in the way that really enables someone to scale their function. So, using goal setting routinely, we talk about it all the time in MSK practice, but actually filling in the goal setting form, actually discussing the obstacles that could arise to prevent them fulfilling that, actively addressing those obstacles with the client and working them through to the point where you've done away with the obstacles, and then often doing that activity with them.
Yeah, go and actually get
actually
stuck into
doing it.
That on that, do you think if I was to, because you've worked with hundreds of therapists, you've treated thousands of patients, you've lectured nationally and internationally, and so you've encountered so much of the industry. I just wonder, could you try to put a percentage on, if we had to dichotomise between those that are trying to burst, that would take that opportunity and burst out of the clinic room door, to those that would be just sort of like, well, no, I'm not in this because of the system. I'm in this because of my own sort of. They're putting their own personal shackles on. If you had to sort of try and work out what is the system and what is the sort of workforce.
Oh, that's a tough question.
I dabble with tough questions now and again.
Yeah, I know that. I know. I'm guessing. My first thought is I reckon there's probably a 20% top and bottom, a 20% that would burst out the clinic room tomorrow and embrace it and do it and just get on with it. Yeah. 20% at the other end who probably wouldn't notice that anything had changed because they're so used to. And I don't mean that to sound unfair, but people who are just don't realise that things could be done differently.
Yeah.
And have been conditioned now in a system where they didn't know there were any other alternatives. And sometimes they have to have someone else show them that opportunity, and that there might be a different way to do things. And then I think we've got a big bunch of people in the middle who, we know we've got people who are pretty fed up with the current model, but not sure how they can make an impact on it. People who are happy to stay in the current system because actually it makes sense for them at that time in their life. We all accept families, jobs in the right place at the right time, all those sorts of things that hold us in a place which might not be our ideal. So that's getting a bit deep and meaningful there. But no,
it matters. The social circumstances around both the clinicians and the patients in that clinic and their boss and stuff. Yeah. So the reason for that nasty question is in part because it does influence, and it'll naturally drag us back to ethics, is because it drags us to, it points us in a direction of priority between the change in the system, as if to suggest that everyone's wanting to burst out that door, as I described it, and then trying to influence the workforce, the people, the individuals, trying to change their mindset, unlock their potential. Because if we were to try to look at where what's the biggest fish to fry, of course we want to try, if possible, to influence both of those things. If we think, like you've just described it, there's this 60% in the middle that are amenable, but that's often ethically and politically difficult because there's people that just want to concentrate narrowly on the individual that's practicing pseudoscience and wouldn't take the opportunities even if they're presented, and then there's people that only want to talk about the system as if it's only that's keeping people down. To talk about the nuance in the middle, that then leads us to take priority. What's your sort of take on where our attention should be if we only had, as we do, a finite amount of time and bandwidth to really discuss these problems? Where do you think we can make the biggest impact?
Well, it's kind of interesting because, of course, the comparison we've just been talking about there in terms of 2020-60 probably also applies to the population that we serve. There may only be 20% of the population we serve that want to also burst out of the clinic door and get on with something more than the clinic's offering them.
Right.
We also know that there's a large proportion of the population who are content with the service they receive, and they're content with they reach their goals, whatever that might be, in the level of activity they want to reach. Now, there's also a huge question there which probably consumes the 60% in the middle, which is the one about how do we get our population increasingly active, prevent long-term disability, improve longevity without comorbidities and all that sort of thing. So for me, the biggest place I would like to see changing and making a difference is getting the people who can be active as soon as possible, and having the right advice at the right time up front. And I think there's the whole drive towards the get it right first time. If we can be getting it right first time, actually, ultimately, that would put me out of business because that would mean that the people who are coming to us have been receiving great advice and have had their confidence built sufficiently to go out and be active again on their own. They've been given all the right advice and they are not sliding down into this disability category. So for me, it would be more about having, I suppose, a shorter timeline at the front end. So let's not have 30, let's not even have 15, although 15 for me, for some people, would be a good number of sessions, because some people who have had multiple complex injuries, they will need 15 to give them the right ability to manage their condition going forward, and not 12 months later find themselves needing a service like ours. So I think it's having that flexibility, which of course exists in some services, to stratify people early and decide which service do they need to be in. Let's get that person into an active rehab service straight off the bat. Let's not put them through something else first and see how they get on. So I think it's about that. It is about that front end in terms of making sure that we manage pain and injury as effectively as possible at the beginning with the right advice, preventing disability and work loss where we can, rather than having to sort it out 3 or 4 years down the line.
The fact that we've got tertiary care services and specialist sort of eighth opinions and things like that is not good on. It doesn't.
No, I mean, one of the big frustrations for me with our clients is that every single one of them probably could have been sorted out sooner. One way or another at some point, even if they got referred to us sooner, which of course is the ideal world, but then we're constrained by the claims process, which I'm sure you're going to get into.
Certainly, well, I want to go there. I mean, one of the ways into that is back to that rehabilitation code, which I keep just putting a flag in because we are going to go back there, but it just reminds me. I've just remembered when you were speaking at the last Big R's event, and you were, as ever, given a impassioned take, and on that panel we were discussing responsibility in all its forms, and you were talking about our responsibility to engage people within their individual goals, and that was kind of a split between them wanting to acquire their function at home and their hobbies and things like that, but then there was also a work element to it, as you've already spoken about. Now, one of the questions that came through on Slido and had been talked about on social media was sort of what would be arguably like a leftist take on the matter politically, where it was as if suggesting that even for research, for anyone to be promoting return to work as a positive outcome would be to suggest that as a species we're obliged to work. Is that not just a part of a right-wing agenda to make us more productive, or to suggest that everything's our responsibility, like a staunch individualist attitude? So it was an interesting and provocative question. I remember really enjoying your answer at the time, but I think it really does speak to part of the sort of my wider question about ethics. It's kind of like, to some people, the idea of returning people to work, or that being part of a goal, is just to suggest that they need to be back at the workhouse to be slaving away. And whilst I sort of know that that's not your approach to things, you're doing it as part of what they want to do. But it's definitely something that made me realise quite acutely that is actually a really politically toxic part of an industry. It's a very difficult thing to talk about. So here's a chance for us to do so.
Okay, well, I mean, it is interesting. I think what's now very interesting and now more available out there in the literature is that work is good for people. That does come with a caveat, because not all work is good. But, if we go back in the UK 30 years ago. What we've got today now is very safe work on the whole, is a very different type of working environment. So a lot of the traditional hazards that were associated with work and old style health and safety have actually gone. We're obviously a much more digital age, there's not as much heavy industry. So in that sense, work is safer, but also there is a definite link between people's identity and self-worth and their ability to work, and then people's motivation to work. So of course some people are motivated intrinsically because they're doing something that they love and they believe in, but not everybody has that, is that fortunate to have that kind of work, and we have to remember that. There are a whole bunch of people who maybe work in what we would consider fairly boring production line type jobs, but actually it's a job that fulfills their needs, whether that is earning enough money to go on their family holiday, earning enough money to support their partner and their children, and that still motivates them to get out of bed every day and go to work. And that not having that motivation, not having a job to get out of bed and go to work for, is also damaging to health. So that means people are more likely to get depressed, more likely to become socially isolated, more likely to develop those comorbidities that then we know are associated with development of persistent pain and all the other things. So for me, it's about when you're working with somebody for whom work is a goal, is understanding that for them, and where they're coming out and what is their motivation and how do we support them to reach that goal, which is their goal for their reasons. And many stories over the years, but one guy really angrily told me that, he only went into work to earn enough money to pay his mortgage so that he could retire on time and go on holidays, and gave me a right telling off before I'd even said a word. But he still wanted to work.
Yeah.
Just because he didn't love that job didn't mean he didn't want to be back at work. And it does bring in another dimension if you're working with employers as well, which obviously I've done a lot of that in the past, and there can be a conflict in terms of getting people back at the right time. And that's another discussion in itself.
Well, no, but again, it's still under that umbrella of general ethics, isn't it? But
yeah.
People, I was talking earlier about priorities and where we focus our attention. And to some people, the problems that you and I are trying to solve, both in terms of myself into professional reform, with yours more specifically with regards to trying to show and offer different models and systems within the personal injury market to show people that you can break the parameters of the clinic room, as we've described it. There's other people that suggest that our goals would be met if we were to simply radically change the way in which our entire system, be that monetary, political system, that's where our attention needs to be, because essentially otherwise we're just tinkering around the edges, and therefore they suggest that we're wasting our time on the small fry and that we should instead be waving placards. Does that ever touch you? Does that ever reach you? I mean, I have obviously my own take on it. I've given thought to it, but does it ever bother you? Because people are suggesting you're being underproductive. People are suggesting that, which is hilarious, really, considering most people do far less than you in every which way. But as a general rule, I've heard that levelled at me. I've heard that levelled at you.
Yep.
Are we wasting our time, and does that ever wound you?
In terms of the work we do with clients?
Well, not necessarily that, but I just mean in general with the advocacy, the changing our...
Yeah, what you're trying to change.
We're changing smaller systems. They're saying, actually, change a small system within a bigger cog, and then it's pointless anyway.
I suppose there's... I've been a pragmatist, I suppose, on every level in terms of, this is the system that we're in.
Yeah.
And it's not ideal. I'm sure most of us would like to change it one way or another. But for me, it's probably about an evolving change and influencing what we can influence, because there are some things that we can't influence. And in the UK, obviously I'm very UK-centric. In the UK, and I brought it up at the big R's, we are a nation that's 96% is companies who have less than 9 employees. If actually we can equip your average man on the street who works for these companies to understand how to care for themselves and how to return to work when it's safe to do so and productive to do so, and they want to do so, then that can change a lot of things on a lot of levels, because that's the majority of the workforce in the UK. Now, in other countries, there will be a different percentage of actually working for large employers, in which case the large employers and the people who work with them on their occupational health strategies and health and well-being are going to have a different level of impact. So that's about making your impact where you can, really, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that pragmatic sort of approach to it, stop burnout.
And for me, trying to do a little bit at every level. So I want to work with individuals, make a difference to their lives, and know that that's significant for them, but then also have an impact on a bigger scale as well, where we can.
Yeah, for sure. And that with that bigger scale, then when you've got that wider team, and I want to talk about the sort of where any issues might occur between the legal professions and the medical professions, because whilst we've talked of the glamour of an MDT and you outlined that really nicely, obviously there's going to be differences, and we don't always know them until we encounter them. So what sort of stuff have you encountered there?
Okay, well, I think the first thing that I've already touched on is the time frame thing, which to a physio is an occupational health background is really bizarre. So in the last 12 months, we brought in our first early intervention program, which is aimed at individuals who've been injured less than 12 months ago. And I have to laugh as I say it, because I used to see people within 2 hours of injuring themselves. So less than 12 months is not early intervention in my book, but that's the way the market is. And if we can start to show that there's a good reason to refer people sooner and get them on the right treatment and rehab sooner, then that's a little bit of a way we can influence the market. I suppose one of the other frustrations is that because we are one cog in a wheel that has a lot of cogs in it, in part of a multidisciplinary team, and we are the interface, if you like, between the client and what's being done for them through their claim, is that we have very little influence at the moment over that process that goes on behind closed doors about the claim process and how long that takes, and the stages that have to happen, and the discussions and meetings that have to go on between all these other people. And ultimately we are beholden to their decision making. And that varies, and the approach that they take varies hugely. So we work with some very proactive solicitors and insurers and case managers, and we're all on the same page, and we're all on board to make things happen as fast as we possibly can. And then there are other scenarios where perhaps there's still a very medically model-driven approach, and it's reliant on a lot of reports from consultants, as just one-off expert witness reports and checking in with the patient. That happens a lot through a lot of cases. That means that the patient is having to present themselves to another expert on a regular basis and be assessed again as to how this has impacted on their lives. And of course, straight away that can bring up the fact that we're working on improving their function and reaching their goals, but then they're constantly being assessed at regular intervals as to how this injury 3 years ago impacted their life today. And I think that's a very difficult place for them to find themselves in.
And they see, and this is where I find it difficult to, not just with counselling clients on this, but there is when they're being assessed on the impact and the gap between where they were and where they are now.
Yeah.
And then to some extent that gap is valued. That gap is the way it's impacted on them so far also has, but certainly in terms of the prognosis and the extent of the claim as to how they then pitch it, how many years beyond this is it going to be disruptive, how they're going to live their life differently because of this event.
Yeah.
And so there's a therapy angle to try to offer a realistic but optimistic sort of outlook to try to make sure you scale function and look at the actual extent of possibilities. And then there's another side which is almost where the to optimize monetary value would be to not exaggerate that deficit, because we've got the Rehab Code and things like that, but to certainly highlight and scrutinize and zoom in at certain parts of the story to make sure that all sides are aware just how disruptive this has been. Does that tug of war influence your care, your interactions with the patients, the time you need with them? How important is that?
I think it does influence it because it can't not. But I think you used quite a good phrase there a couple of sentences ago about the gap. Our role is to step into the gap and close the gap with that person, help them close the gap for the long term. And that's our primary goal. And we make sure that the client understands that when they're proposed our program, and that the case manager understands that. And that's what we're there to do, is improve their function, get them a better functional outcome. And we need them to sign up to it as best they can, but of course they don't always fully understand what the implications of that are, and that can mean that between one review and another, they improve in their function significantly, they close that gap, and the difference therefore in their long-term prognosis is improved. That potentially has a financial impact on the value of their claim, which of course is way beyond my control. We're not involved in anything to do with that, but it does mean that there may well be a conflict for the client. Sometimes they will express it to us directly, and obviously that then takes time to talk through as far as we can. We don't get into the detail of it, but we do explain our programme is there to support them, that it's being funded by the whole group, the whole team, because we want to restore them to as close to their pre-injury function as possible, because that's what they, deserve to be. And we have to encourage the client to have those discussions with the other members of the team, to speak to their solicitor, to speak to their case manager, so that they are reassured. My understanding is that nobody should be penalised for improving, but that of course doesn't necessarily change the way the client perceives that scenario.
And also it's that can be said, but actually, I mean, no one's explicitly doing that, but then on the weight of everything, if they've improved, then naturally, as we've described, the prognosis and what is being valued as impact is going to be less. And Glenn Whitehead, who spoke at the last Design to Move team day, I think he spoke to that very well, where he said everything can be done, but essentially I kept pestering with a question, and he said, no, of course you're right, there is this gap which we have to put onto good faith.
I think the other thing to remember as well, I was thinking about it in preparation for today though, is that our rehabilitation can't happen without the legal process happening. So also, if there wasn't a legal process in place, it's quite likely that the client wouldn't be getting that rehabilitation intervention at all. So also the outcome is that the client is getting offered the rehabilitation and they have the potential to improve. And without this process, frustrating as it can be at times, that just wouldn't be there.
So we need to respect that infrastructure a lot, because it brought them to us.
The infrastructure is actually what makes us able to work with them and able to support them to improve, whereas if they didn't go down that route, quite likely they'd have been discharged from statutory care thinking, we use this term a lot, thinking this is it. Actually, this is as good as I'm going to get. I've got to get on with it as it is, and living the rest of their lives, not knowing that actually perhaps they could have been better than they were.
If I was to invent a case study example, but also it's a realistic one in which we've all seen, which is, say, a passenger versus car, obvious fault of driver. Let's say they were texting and they've hit someone on a pedestrian crossing in which it was red. So we're dealing with something that hasn't got complex socially, don't get me wrong, but it's not got any ambiguity with regards to fault there. That's just so flown around a corner and hit a pedestrian who's survived but has major orthopedic, let's say, potentially even neurological injuries, let's say spinal neurological rather than head injury for the classic sort of Design to Move case. In that circumstance, if a patient wasn't to know the difficulties it is in rehabilitating someone 5 years post than 12 months post, do you think that there's a case, because I think, you can hear in my question, I think there is a legit reason that they might think, well, I want to be paid out in the vastness of extent of what this could do to my life, and almost you'd want to then I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. So they'll rehabilitate so they can just exist.
Yep.
Get paid out on the extent of it being incredibly life changing, and then they hope they can then think that they can just start the clock again and think, well, I'll rehabilitate it once I've been appropriately remunerated for that tragedy.
Yeah.
So, as I say, it's weighted in my question. I think I can understand that logic. It has some flaws to it.
Yeah.
But for them to not know, I can imagine some are tempted by that process where it's just like
the claim is a priority to some extent.
Well, it is a major priority for a lot of people, because if you think, for those of us who've been fortunate enough not to suffer this type of injury, they are life-changing, but in a way that is not so dramatic that it's necessarily really obvious to the outside world. So I talk about the ripple effect. It just has such a massive ripple effect on everybody around the client. So a couple of examples. I had a case last year, not dissimilar to the one you've just described, and the lady was actually not a UK national. She normally lives overseas. She was visiting her family here, visiting a friend one day in Cornwall, ended up having an injury down there, and then ended up having to stay 6 months with her family in the UK, which brought up so many issues in terms of visas, family dynamics, space. She had to basically live in their living room. They had to change their whole house around. They had children at school. And the impact is massive. And I think there is a period where people just need to get their initial healing done. So again, a lot of what we deal with is orthopedic injury. So there's got to be that healing time for their orthopedic injuries and any surgery that has to happen. And then they've got to try and reach some level of normality. So I do think actually, for us to maybe turn up at 12 weeks for some of these patients equally wouldn't work, because they're not ready, because they're just dealing with such a lot of fallout. Another case, again, it's not unusual. We'll find that partners or mums and dads have given up work to look after the injured person. So they then lost a job. And that ripple effect goes on, and then a resentment can build up in the family. There's a lot of psychosocial issues that end up building up around the client through no fault of their own. So I absolutely can see that some people need to get to some level of stability financially as well. If they've had to make changes to the house, if they've lost their job, they can no longer drive, that they need financial input. And again, working with proactive solicitors, they recognise that, and they recognise that they can make that client's life easier by getting the funds in as soon as possible to at least give somebody that stable base from which they can then begin to contemplate, well, what more might there be to life? At that point, they're just trying to survive, just trying to get through the confusion that's occurred as a result of their injury. And only down the line will they now be able to go, right, I think I might be ready. I'd really like to get back to walking my dog, or being able to run 5K, or I used to like going to the gym, but I'm a bit scared about going now. And they weren't ready, and now they are ready. So,
in your experience, is there a threshold that gets crossed? I don't know if you could put a time frame on it, or if it's so individualised, but where the bitterness, shall we say, which not the right word for all, but there's just like a generalised animosity, resentment, and annoyance that's happened to them. Does that dust need to settle prior to therapy, in your opinion? And if so, is there a classic time frame in which any sensible early intervention for this particular type of patient I just described, that it would be worth us waiting on?
That's a really interesting question. It is very, very individualised, and I've worked with people for whom you can, when you do start an early intervention program. So the lady I've just described, who ended up staying in the UK a lot longer than planned, you can see that the first few weeks they're just trying to recover, and they're just working on their recovery. Then as they get over that obstacle, they realise the enormity of what's gone on, and the anger can build. And I think from our point of view, we have to just be aware of that process and help support them. And again, this is a good place to mention that often we may already be part of a multidisciplinary team that includes psychologists and occupational therapists. If we don't already have someone in place, we may well be the people who pick up that there is a need for that. And we use various outcome measures, some well-known, some not so well-known, about assessing their levels of post-traumatic stress. And if we're picking that up as high and there isn't a psychologist involved, we will often recommend to the case manager that is brought in, because although we happily manage a lot of psychosocial questions, we'll support somebody through those questions and then tell them that it's normal to some extent to feel that way and to go through that process. Sometimes they need extra support, but fortunately we can signpost to that, and normally that is then provided, which of course is brilliant, to be able to have someone then have the full support of a whole team who can take them through that period is not something you often get the opportunity to do.
For sure. That is an example. Those things we've just mentioned are examples of what we could consider perverse incentives within finances and wellness, based on how we see the evidence and how we can understand how it happens, but ideally we'd find ways to solve the system and the communication between parties and the client to solve that. Another example of said potential for perverse incentives, which if anything's more difficult to talk about, more politically toxic, is the concept in which people would be supported by the state through Department of Work and Pensions and Benefits. And again, it once again speaks to, you walk into controversies at different times when you're talking, but you were speaking at the Vocational Rehab Association or something like that, I think it was. And there was an example where there was a patient advocate who had a major spinal cord injury who was then explaining the difficulties that they have. He was part of trying to re-engage people. Getting people back into work when they have to meet a threshold that is unrealistic for entry-level redeployment, to meet a threshold to stop it costing the patient money to go back into work, and that then the amount of groans in a room, because that's a very difficult thing to discuss politically, because it feels mean, but actually it's like all the right motives were there, and he was wanting to, because people wanted to get back to work, but they said, I want to go back to work, I've been offered this job, it's 25 grand, but I'm on 30. Yeah. And so whilst in that circumstance with the spinal cord injury and stuff, and he was admitting that that's a market in which it's not a market of injury, that's a silly way of putting it, but a category of injury in which he said that gets highlighted. Yeah. He said that it's tricky and we need to have a more mature conversation about it. Now, unfortunately, in that very room, especially some of the questions that came after us, it wasn't that mature conversation that he was hoping for, unfortunately. Some activists sort of came and sort of made him upset, and I didn't like that. But I wondered if you had any sort of takes on that, having worked in that area, as to where that threshold is to make sure we're not nasty in either direction. We don't disable people by keeping them out of the workplace when they'd like to be, but also making sure we're not then leaving people on a breadline.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's an interesting and a very UK-centric problem that we have, because a lot of some of the other countries around the world have a completely different systems, which some may prefer, some may not. So, if we stay on the UK, the current welfare benefit system, whether you like it or not, provides support for people looking for work and who have been out of work for various reasons. Obviously, there's been quite a lot of controversy over various aspects of it and how people are assessed over the last couple of years. And I've seen people who we currently see for Design to Move, who are very extreme cases. Often it's very clear that they're not ready to work, and they will get the advantage of the benefits whilst they need them, and then when they are able to work, they will come off them and they'll go back hopefully into employment. I've also worked with patients where I've seen them in just normal NHS clinics, in private clinics, struggling as well, being confronted with somebody deciding that they should now be fit for work when they've been unfit for work for 10 years. It's not an ideal system. There's loads of pitfalls with it. But again, we do have this system in place to try and support people back into work. And there is a support system there. I think one of the things you're alluding to is that there is a financial threshold, which is around the number of hours and the pay that you get before you lose your benefits. So there's been various phrases over the years talk about it as supported work or therapeutic work, and that means that you can usually work up to 15 hours a week before you lose your benefits. And therefore, if you go over that, you'd then be needing to take your salary, but of course your salary may only be half what your normal salary would be, which will turn out to be less than your benefits. And in a flags, we talk about psychosocial flags. This is very much what would be classed as a black flag. It's a societal influence that you and I can't change the way that works. But I think one of the things that we would very much work towards, whether I was in OccuHealth, whether I was talking to someone in the NHS or one of our Design to Move clients, about where we can, looking to move through that phase, that 16-hour plus window, which is the kind of risky bit, as quickly as we can with a plan. So we're not saying, oh, well, you're just going to go up to 18 hours and sit there forever unless we find that is your top level. We're actually going to try to move you through those stages and get you out of the other side of that back up to normal as fast as possible with a date, a target date. So that, again, around your goal setting and supporting somebody to do that. There are, of course, people, though, who cannot go back to that level of function and that number of hours in the same job. And then it's about having to be creative. That really starts to move out of the physio's scope, obviously, but it's about then signposting people. We do need to go and speak to the advisors at the job centre or Citizens Advice Bureau, or have a conversation with your employer about alternative employment, an alternative role. But again, most of the country don't work for big employers who have another job just sat around the corner waiting for them. So that will come back to having a discussion with their boss of the small business that they work in, and whether that's sustainable or not, and reasonable for the employer. So there's lots of layers to it. So it is a challenge, but you compare that to some of the other countries where there is no welfare benefit system at all, and once you're injured and once you've lost your job, you can't even access private health insurance, so you can't pay for your own medical care.
Yeah.
So in relation to that, it can be quite good.
Yeah, of course. And how on whilst we can't put numbers to it, but how well do you think it's balanced at the moment? Do you think we need to, because there's one side of a spectrum which is just, if someone says they can't work, you believe them, you pay them as close to minimum wage even as you can, and then they'll be nothing but honest, and they'll just return to work when they see fit if they can get a job that they want to do, is one side of it. And the other side of it is that you need to reduce the welfare state so significantly that you've just got this visceral pressure to feed yourself and family that then will drive you towards selling your labour. And of course, we're talking about the middle ground. I know you enough to know that you're neither of those people, but I just mean, like, generally speaking, how well do you think the current system is
I don't know. I think there's two distinct groups of people. There's the group of people who have found themselves injured or ill and had a job before, and therefore being out of work is a temporary state, and they want to return to work, and they will proactively they will return to that with the right support, and the level of the support they need will vary from some people needing none to some people needing lots. But then I think you've got a completely different set of people, a population that I've never particularly worked with, which is the people who have been out of work a very long time, generational unemployment. That I think is a very different ball game, and I think the welfare state has to try and cover both bases, and I think that's probably where the challenge is, that actually trying to serve one doesn't necessarily serve the other, because the two groups have very different needs.
And there's no distinct, but they do have different needs, but there's no distinct threshold between them, or line between them. Sometimes there's a mix in there. Yeah, no, that's certainly tricky. What's the way in which we can sort of counsel patients on how to best interact with that? Do you think that whilst the problems are complex, some of the solutions can be trying to help them change what they can change and start to, because that's what you kind of described about that incremental approach. So we talked about that natural threshold at, let's say, 16, 18 hours. You're describing a set of stairs either side of that stop that being a more overt bump in the road. I'm mixing my metaphors there, aren't I? But generally speaking, I like that approach, but that approach is arguably individualistic in a sense that you're saying, let's control what you can, and then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But when we do cross that bridge, here I'm mixing another metaphor, it's less of a major one. Is that the right level of analysis in your opinion, or do you think that even at that stage it's sort of like, well, no, actually all of those things need to feed into system-based change as well?
Well, a lot of those things are driven by an employer. Right. So the stages and the speed at which you can do those things may be set down in an HR policy and a return to work policy and things like that. Mm-hmm. So that's often the complexity that as therapists we come up against, because if you're working in the NHS and that individual works for that employer, and that employer has a particular process and what they like as an ideal time frame, and a lot of employers have an ideal time frame they want someone to cross those boundaries over, is trying to get the communications there about the fact that actually that might just not be possible. So I had one case that was very clear. Several years ago, somebody had spinal fusion surgery. So we know we've got 12 weeks where absolutely we're not going to put that person into a job that is unpredictable, which it was, of the types of physical demands they might find themselves doing within the 12-week framework, because we all wanted to see some really good solid healing on the scans from a medical model perspective. We needed to all be content that that was there, but the organisation wanted a 6-week return to work plan, because that's what they do, and they didn't want to show favour one person or another. But of course, actually, they are also required to do what's reasonable under the law, the Equality Act. And in that instance, I worked in the occupational health department. I was able to put a case forward to say, well, I'm afraid that this is the way it is. This is what's been done. This is the clinical situation. A 6-week return to work plan will be fine once we've got over that 12-week point. And it didn't mean that person couldn't come back to work at all before the 12-week point. It just meant that we couldn't guarantee they'd be back at full hours by then, because we knew there were certain things they couldn't do. So when it comes back to the communication and saying, well, it's not going to be possible to have them back full-time 12 weeks, but it would be possible to do this. And that's the beauty, I suppose, it brings us into the footnote territory around the fact that I was able to document and report and comment on why that was, and make some suggestions about how they could manage that, so you had a good outcome for everybody.
When you encounter difficulties like that you're describing, do you find that those are sort of rigid and arbitrary systems, or obnoxious people, managers, that sort of thing? More often than not, I'm sure you've encountered both.
It's normally the policy and the process. So if you imagine that, within occupational health settings, especially this type of scenario, you've got a set of stakeholders. You've got the line manager, you've got the HR manager, you've got the health and safety guys, you've got the patient themselves, you've got their colleagues, and us in Occu Health. So you've got a lot of people who have to fulfil a lot of things to make a workplace safe and effective and productive, and actually does what it's supposed to do. So I think having an appreciation of what those other people have to adhere to, their standards, their policies, their processes, and respecting that, but then putting your side of the picture across and finding a collaborative solution is usually the way that works best. And when I've encountered people who may be a bit stroppy about that, it's often a case of them not understanding, them being fearful, putting somebody back to work too soon and put them at risk, or fearful of them not fitting in the process that they think they have to follow. Usually people are willing to take the occupational health advice, and it's worth kind of commenting as well there that it's quite common that if an organisation has occupational health, they will take the occupational health advice over that of a GP, because the occupational health department understand the nature of the work and the task and the policies and procedures that exist in that workplace. So
and you, I mean, I know in your previous roles you've very much been involved in this, but as it stands, when you're involved in these complex cases, do you still liaise closely with all those departments? Do you still find yourself being an advocate for the patient where necessary, where there might be a disparity between your assessment and analysis of the problem and solutions and what is being sort of dictated top down?
It's actually quite different with these personal injury cases, because often we may not get involved with the employer at all. So if you think of the role of a case manager, and case management now has a lot of evidence to support its use within occupational health within a company, but also within the personal injury sector and others, that the role of the case manager is to coordinate the team and to coordinate the communications and liaison. So in a lot of the cases we work with, that process may be ongoing between the case manager and the employer. And then the other type of person that can get involved with our cases is vocational counsellors, vocational rehabilitation people, and their specific role is to work with the employer and return the person to work. So that actually means that we often are have taken a step back relative to what I used to do in terms of making those direct communications, but it does mean that we can work really well in us focusing on the rehab needs for the vocational goal, the occupational tasks. So we can really focus on the physical capacity, and the vocational person is actually the one doing the meetings and the discussions about the return to work plan. But it does mean communication has to be as effective as possible in terms of us saying, well, actually, this is where we're at. This is the kind of progress we're making. I think they'll be able to do that by 4 weeks' time. Then, you can build that in. And I've had cases where I have worked on the functional capacity alongside the vocational advisor, and that has then enabled us to recommend the kind of job this person should then look for.
Right.
So that was someone who was obviously out of the work they wanted to be doing. They were in a job, but it wasn't the type of work they wanted to be doing, and we were able to support that progression.
Brilliant. But you're there supporting the case manager as they require it, rather than you're not going to be.
Yeah.
That's something that, of course, I wasn't meaning to skirt over.
Yeah.
You're supporting that process. You're not necessarily wading in and shaking your fist at the
and again, every
line
case
manager's face without permission.
Every case is different in that, for some of them we will visit the workplace and meet the managers, and we'll do have a look at the tasks and the jobs and have a chat. But for others, we're not needed, because if you remember now, we've been talking about being in a multidisciplinary team. A lot of the case managers are occupational therapists, and what I call real occupational therapists, and they really understand the workplace, and they are capable of doing that, and they are the person appointed to drive that, and we're there to support the client to meet that return to work goal, and that's ideal.
No, of course. Now, if we go to my final sort of contention, then we're going to see it home by talking about solutions. But like one of the things that classically we can do a bit of a history lesson on the fact that my patient that I just made up, that's pedestrian versus car. Classically, you go back not that many years. You have to go back for people, and it still happens, unfortunately, where once their orthopaedic injuries have healed or can be seen to have healed, if any pain persists beyond any bony or soft tissue healing process, then they're considered to be malingering, because the only understanding of pain at that point was that it was just, there was no distinction, a crisp distinction made in certainly in most circles between nociception and pain, and the understanding of the fact that pain is a much more complex phenomena than just broken bits. So that malingering was happening. Do you think that there's an appropriate speed of movement away from that, where that true victim blaming that went on, where they were just seen as being a psychological phenomena and at worst a social phenomena in which they were simply putting that on, and that there needed to be a process in which it needed to be ratted out?
Yeah, definitely. I think we are moving away from that, thank goodness. One of the things that we do with Design to Move is the cases we see, they may, for all intents and purposes, be healed. They may have good range of movement. They may have good strength and all the rest of it. But one of their major factors is a lack of confidence and fear. And they've become fear avoidant about certain tasks or behaviours. They've had serious, horrible injuries, and they are scared about re-injuring or doing too much too soon, or doing something that could set back their healing. And we're not talking about 6 weeks worth of being uncomfortable. We're talking about 12, 24, 36 months worth of recovering to this point. The last thing they want to do is to set themselves back. So often the people that we're seeing, and the people we're seeing because the case managers recognise the need, is people who have the potential to get further along, to realise their hopes and their aspirations again, but are being held back by a combination of psychosocial factors and physical factors, and then the way that those are intertwined in their head, in that their understanding of movement and activity is still tied in with a belief around harm and fear, and not knowing where to start.
Right. Yeah.
And that can mean that actually, once we know that those are the locks that need unlocking, and we can help them find the keys amongst all the sorts of things that we can use, that becomes very satisfying, because you can see how somebody can change their understanding and move forward. And when we look at it in a relatively short space of time, given what they've been through, what we're obviously not quite so able to sort out without the rest of the team around us is the ripple effect that's gone on all around them. And the impact that has on every level.
Do you sometimes get sucked into being almost trying to micromanage that, and you're almost like trying to run interventions in ways that just aren't within, not necessarily outside your scope, but definitely
Oh, yeah.
unlikely to yield any fruit. Really.
Well, it's also the times when you go into a client's home and you just get confronted with the absolutely less than ideal environment to carry out a session.
Right,
so last week, a client there with 3-year-olds off nursery that day. One of the dogs is running around. The other dog is not very well and is going to have to go to the vet later, and just chaos.
Yeah.
But actually, what's really interesting about that, although it's difficult to deliver an ideal treatment session in the way that we might like,
Sure.
a really clean, planned session, that's the reality of what these people are having to factor all our rehab in around.
It's representative, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's the reality of if that person had just presented for a 30-minute clinic appointment and we'd given them, this perhaps even the same advice, and then sent them home and expected them to implement it, versus actually being there and seeing how they're having to struggle with all the stuff that's happened as a direct result of their injury, a lot of the chaos around them, that you can just, make things more realistic and achievable for them.
No, exactly. And again, it's that come to tailoring it individually.
Very individualised. And, there are often times when, you actually don't do anything that on paper would look like good rehab, but that was not what was required that day. It just wasn't going to happen. But what you have done is you've been there, you've supported them, and you have enabled them to get over that next bump in the road on their journey.
That situation, like we say, it's representative to them. It's not. None of it. Otherwise, it's funny because then you end up in the sterile parameters that we described before as being trying to move away from. So no, at least it's realistic. Now, we're fortunately moving away. We're both clearly chuffed that we're moving away from that ability to suggest malingering on people just because of their persistent pain. That's clearly more complex than the broken bits. But within this industry, there's still a legitimate role, according to most solicitors and most case managers, for covert surveillance and the like.
Yeah.
So, because unfortunately that does still occur to some extent, whilst the term I think should be made redundant. Malingering I don't like, but the idea in which unfortunately some people do feel that they could or can embellish their claims of disability and suggest that they are struggling more than they are. Now, again, a very contentious area, because as soon as it's being inferred on someone that doesn't need it, that has a huge consequence in which they then don't want to be leaving the house in case they're snapped, when actually we're telling them to. Yeah. And then also, but on the other side of it, the people that are committing fraud and are being dishonest, they are spoiling it for the others. So what's your take on that?
Well, unfortunately, there will probably always be those people, but they're in the minority. In my career, I've only come across maybe 3 or 4 or 5 people. And personally, the way I kind of look on it is that what's motivating them to take that angle is something that I don't understand. There's stuff that motivates them to behave like that means that their psychosocial issues are much greater than their physical issues, and obviously that's not something that I can solve for them. Right. But I think the majority of people aren't like that, and the majority of the cases we deal with, again, the solicitors will tell them that they need to be aware that they probably are they will be under surveillance. And I think what's important for us is to understand that, to reassure clients that if we have given them instructions and supporting them to go out and be more active and to do these things, then what will come from that is that, yes, the surveillance will identify that they have been out and about, and that will correlate up with the records and the plans that we've created and say, well, yep, the physio told them to get out and go cycling 3 times a week. So yes, you would expect to see them out cycling. And in fact, if you haven't seen them out cycling, we want to know.
Yeah, it should be counter surveillance. Right?
Yeah, because actually, and I did have that exact example a good few years ago now, when an employer had seen somebody out and about cycling, and I was, that's great. I'm really pleased that you have, because that's exactly what they should be doing right now.
Brilliant.
So, yeah.
The consequences, though, they're not always the covert surveillance or the employers or anything like that. But I think there's some work we need to do as a society to better understand rehabilitation, because when someone's off work and then you bump into them in the shops, sometimes instincts are to think, well, they look well. There's like a skepticism that creeps in to some degree, which is just we need our intuitions to cut the other way.
Yeah,
and I think that part of that
balance.
Part of that is because of course, if you then find them on the start line of the marathon and they were off the day before suggesting they've a broken leg, then okay, of course we've got the silly examples like that would be far on the other side of it, where skepticism should be employed liberally. But as a general rule, I think that because of our general societal lack of understanding for graded rehabilitation should be at the heart of what we do and understand things of, is that if you're poorly, take yourself to bed. Still seems to be, at least in people's subconscious, so they shouldn't expect that you should be in bed rather than in Tesco's. Is a funny...
A great example of some of the cases that I've worked with over the years is, we might have somebody who we've specifically set a goal for them to go into work once a week to start exposing them to the work environment, but they find that really anxiety provoking. Right. So that will be a joint goal between us and a psychologist around getting out to the workplace, a specific place that they have fears around, and may have physical obstacles around. Another one, fearful of taking their child out walking, and that again being a joint goal, walking and the fear, myself and the psychologist both supporting the client to get out and do the walking and to have good strategies in place for the anxiety that might bring on. There's lots of reasons that somebody might be starting to go out or to start to socialise again. One, of course, the big things that gets lost after a serious injury is confidence in social environments and being able to go back down the pub and have a meaningful evening with your friends, because that used to involve pool and you feel you can't play pool right now. That's really important. And therefore I suppose that's one of the reasons we do need to document it, that is a goal. That is something we are specifically going to work on. So we expect people to be out and about doing that, but they then, probably their immediate friends around them will be understanding that, and that actually it's not an easy thing to do, but it's the wider people around that who might just spot that person down the pub and wonder what they're up to, that make a judgment, don't they?
Yeah, and there's got to be a degree of resilience that's trained where we can't always... we can't always react poorly to what any Tom, Dick and Harry thinks about us, and obviously those closest to us and our close work friends, colleagues and family or whatever should be at least more sympathetic in these stages. I think that, like I say, our intuition should cut the other way, and the more we can try and that be the starting off point, in which from there, then given good evidence, then perhaps be sceptical, but start at a raw skepticism, I think, is unhealthy.
Yeah, so even the ones problem. I've had one or two cases that have been, in the end, not designed to move cases. These are going back quite a long time. Outright fraud, and when you look back at them, I just think, one of them I knew the person was capable of more than they were exhibiting, but I couldn't get to the bottom of it. And again, I wasn't in a position where I could dig and get to the bottom and do anything about whatever I might find. I just flagged up my concerns to the rest of the team and said, I'm continue working with the person, but I actually did insist that they brought a psychologist on board as well, because I didn't think we were going to get very far, and I was right, because I thought the obstacles were more psychological. And then one of the others, this is a classic Occy Health one actually, the employer sent the person to be assessed by me after they'd been off work for 8 months with a shoulder problem. I said, actually, they are fit to go back to work now, today, and they would have been fit 5 months ago to go back to work. So sent them earlier, really, for an assessment. And later down the line, it transpired that person had been engaged in another job with another employer since the 5 months previous.
Wow.
And of course, that was, and actually it was kind of good to find out that they did actually call me down the line and said, we thought you'd be interested to know that this is what the outcome was. I'm like, yeah, I'm very interested to know, because that person was fit when I saw them.
And you smelt that almost, didn't you? You could tell that there was something about.
Well, it was just that this person is as fit today as they would have been 5 months ago, because the nature of the condition they presented with. They could have easily gone back to work. We probably still would have done a phased return because of that person was supposedly been off work 8 months, so they were deconditioned. We would have had a little bit of interim time just to make sure that was a successful return to work. And it was then that when I said they're fit to go back, do this, they offered that, and that actually the person couldn't do it because they got another job.
Sure, wow, of course they couldn't. Yeah, scary stuff. Now let's finish with a flourish with regards to, because we've touched on a variety of different proposed solutions and priorities in which you are on with, what Design to Move are on with, what suggested things that we think could be happening on a bigger picture level. But let's just try and hit those then. Where do you think we should prioritise solutions, and where do you think, what are Design to Move up to in contributing to or even leading on some of those things?
Well, Design to Move only exists because there's not sufficient intervention earlier of the right type. So, I mean, obviously on priority in the bigger scale of things, the big impact is if we could be getting it right first time more often in musculoskeletal outpatients, where a lot of these patients will present because they have complex orthopedic injuries. But I do, the current problem we've got is it lacks the flexibility, I think, to deal with complex cases. And I do understand the commissioning landscape. They want to keep it nice and straightforward, and it's based around your average patient, and these aren't your average patient. These are your outliers. But unfortunately, that means the outliers get sort of let down by the system. There's not the flexibility there to give them the length of sessions they need or the number of sessions they need, and also to break out of the clinic if that's what's required. And of course that has a knock-on impact. If we start introducing these clients and providing for them, there will be a knock-on need for greater learning amongst the staff delivering it to be able to do some of those things, not least the work stuff. I'll leave that for another time, but that ability to make that assessment and make those recommendations around return to work, but also the scaling up of the function to a level that means that person can live that full and meaningful life, not just an existence. And I know that that's a tricky one, and I think that will take a long time. It will come as we start to value the role of rehabilitation as much as we have valued the role of other interventions over the years. We've got a whole nother day for that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we can start to tip that focus away from interventional things, injections, acupuncture, investigations where they're not really needed, and all those things, towards a rehabilitation model, an active model, the preparing and enabling someone for self-management for the long term, then that's where the whole system needs to be going, in my opinion.
No, well, for sure. It's been a really wide-reaching and detailed interview, so thank you for your honesty. Just to bring it home then, what would your final thoughts be, and how can you direct people, regardless of how they've come to the show, regardless of what angle they come at, what profession, etc., how would you say that they can get in touch with you and find out more about your services if they're interested?
Okay, well, our main point of contact for anyone who's interested in learning a little bit more is our website at designedtomove.co.uk. But particularly, I think, we're interested in hearing from potential clinicians who have resonated with any of the things that we've been discussing and are interested in being involved in providing, creative rehabilitation and looking for the solutions to some of the things that we've mentioned in the podcast, in terms of working proactively with the wider multidisciplinary team, trying to influence the system to some extent by an earlier intervention, all those sorts of things. So any clinicians who might be interested then in terms of physios, then do get in touch and let us know that you might be interested in learning and joining our team, and we'd be delighted to hear from you. And then obviously, if you are a case manager, somebody involved in the personal injury market, and you've been listening to this, then also please come and visit our website and then get in touch with us. We can give you much more information about our services as a whole and how we work and why our services are a little bit different. And we're very happy to do that on a general level, but we're also very happy to talk through specific cases. And sometimes, that chat can give you the clarity about whether our services might be right for somebody, but equally we'll also tell you if we think our services aren't quite the right service at this time or ever for a particular case. So come to the website, get in touch either via email or by phone, and we'd love to help in whatever way we can.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely brilliant to take this deep dive, and can't believe it. We've spoken about this stuff before, but I'm amazed at how much I've gone on to learn even from this, because we've gone into such detail. So thank you, and keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
As we're dealing with an increasingly complex society at large when it comes to health concerns, both in terms of the medical variables and ailing and aging population, but also in terms of social features and how they are predeterminants of health sometimes, I just think it's really important that you take the time to scrutinise your own thoughts and feelings with regards to the way in which where your ethics lie on these issues. And Heather's insight on this, I think, is really valuable, but also just totally invite any disagreements you might have when you scrutinise your own thoughts. You can tell from this interview, I'm a bit of a fanboy, massive mentor of mine, and certainly someone whose journey it really resonates with me in so many ways. It's one of the reasons why I work with her, and I'm very proud to be involved with Design to Move. And so there's my bias straight out the gates, but it's definitely something that we're both very open to hearing out other sides of it. And there's very rarely an argument we've not heard in this direction, but generally it's something that there's very much a variety of different views in which we love to engage with. So please do get in touch. info@designtomove.co.uk, as well as for people that are interested in joining the team, or if you have any cases in which you'd like to discuss with Design to Move. Trust me, there's a great sort of system in place in which there can be a full consultation for whether or not the case is appropriate or not, and the or not is very relevant there. It's certainly something that we always pride ourselves in, the fact that we don't involve ourselves where we can't be helpful, and we signpost to where is, if that is the case. So do get in touch, info@designtomove.co.uk, to speak to Heather and team. And in the meantime, please do look at Designed to Move on social media, and follow us on all major channels. And certainly signing up on the website is a wise move, designtomove.co.uk, for newsletters and all things related to improving your skill set in what is an ever complex market in which you need to best understand if you really want to stay ahead of the game. I'm at Jack A. Chew on Twitter. At TPM Podcast is where you'll find the Physio Matters team, and all of our resources often get streamed through there, so do pay attention to that. Buy tickets.at/reforming-MSK for tickets which gives you access to the full live streams for the Reforming MSK Practice Conference, in which is under the hashtag #TheBigRs. So do get in touch with that, and reform.physio/community to sign up for all the material to keep you ticking over with the reform agenda that we're building, as forming a consensus with as many voices of as many different disciplines as possible. So do try and click on at least one of those links that I've just given you. I'm well aware I've just reeled off like a number of different things that you need to visit, but if you're interested in what we're doing and you believe in the power of conversation, then please do join it, because that is where you really can put your money where your mouth is and help us to make sure that we turn conversation into action. So until next month, I have the honours of what you all tune in for, which is to say that you've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast, discussing physio matters because physio matters.